Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hao Huang, Associate Professor of Social Sciences, and welcome to the Illinois Tech Social Sciences Great Problems, Great Minds seminar series. For today's seminar, we will open the floor to the questions at the end after the talk. Today's speaker, Erica Sheppard, Dr. Erica Sheppard is a distinguished research professor emeritus in the geography department at UCLA. He completed a bachelor's science honors degree in geography at Bristol University and a master and PhD degree in geography at the University of Toronto. He taught at the University of Minnesota for 36 years, while he was awarded a Regents Professorship before becoming the Accident Humboldt Chair at the university, where he recently retired. At Minnesota, he co-directed its interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Global Change and co-founded its Masters of Development Practice program. He holds an honorary Doctor of Laws from the University of Bristol and served as president of the American Association of Geographers and co-edited article Environment and Planning A and currently Area Development and Policy. His scholarship embraces geographic political economy, socio-spatial theory, and geographical epistemologies, currently focusing on uneven geographies of capitalist globalization, modern capitalist practices, southern urban theory, urban social movements, and urban land transformations in southern cities. His research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, Urban Studies Foundation, Competent Foundation, Manner Foundation, and the National Center for Geographic Information Analysis and Analysis. His publications include 13 books and some 200 referred journal articles and book chapters. His most recent books are Spatial Histories and Radical Geography, North American and Beyond, published by John Winning and Sons, Urban Studies Inside Out, Theory, Method, Practice, published by Sergi Publishing, and the Limits to Globalization, Geographic Disruptions of Capitalist Development, published by Oxford University Press. He has supervised over 16 PhD and master students undertaking research in North and South America, East, Southeastern, and South Asian, and Sub-Saharan Africa, also serving on the communities of over 200 other graduate students. It's a great honor to have Professor Sheppard.
Thank you, Huang Hao, and thank you for inviting me to this series of seminars, Great Minds seminars. Let me bring up my lecture slides so that you can see them. So, I mean, the title of this series is, of course, an impressive one, Great Minds, Big Ideas. So this is kind of a big idea presentation. It really cuts across a lot of work I've been doing over the last 30 years to try and rethink this thing that we've come to call globalization from a geographical perspective. Hang on, I'm not, this thing's not advancing. Why? There we go. So we're at a moment where all of a sudden globalization has become seen as not a natural and inevitable phenomenon, but a phenomenon which people are posing all kinds of questions, right? It's a moment where we're seeing a certain kind of deglobalization, of onshoring of production. We're seeing the emergence, sadly, of a kind of ethno-nationalism in many different countries, with the focus on the nation rather than on the globe. It's a moment of environmental crises and their relationships to globalization, and a moment of many kinds of protests. So it's in this moment that I think it's really important to reassess what was meant by globalization, what should be meant by globalization, and whether we can think about alternatives. And I want to do this from a geographical perspective, as the subtitle says, a spatio-temporal perspective, one that gives, I think, a different view of how globalization functions, and gives us space to think differently also about other possibilities to the norm, right? So in this talk, we want to think, first of all, as geographers, about space. Space has many different aspects, often referred to as spatialities. There's place, there's the connectivities between places, interscalar relations. And in all of these cases, we think about how these spatialities are produced by social processes, economic, political, cultural processes. But the spaces that produce then shape those processes themselves, something that the geographer Soja long ago referred to as the socio-spatial dialectic. And I want to introduce a new concept, one that's probably less familiar to you, but is an important spatial concept, I think. And this is the idea of socio-spatial positionality. Thinking about people, but also about places in terms of how they are connected into the rest of the world, and how their position within those broader processes shapes what happens there and shapes the possibilities and power relations that can be invoked through those places. A second aspect of thinking geographically is to pay attention to things that are often separated in other disciplines but are integrated in geography: economic processes, social processes, political processes, cultural processes, if you will, economics, sociology, political science, anthropology, biophysical processes, all of which are interrelated with one another. And particularly thinking about how the biophysical world is dialectically related to the social world. We are shaping that world, but the effects we have in it come back to shape what's possible for us. And to decenter the economic ways of thinking and not really presume that they have necessarily all the answers. So to think geographically about globalization is to take seriously space and to take seriously these interdisciplinary relationships. And this is what we train our geography students to do. I have sort of quite a few points I want to try and get through in the next 45 minutes. Whether we actually get to Jakarta at the end will depend a lot on how quickly this goes. But we want to start by looking at what we conventionally mean by globalization, and then take a deep historical perspective on how the past shapes global possibilities in the present. Then we'll turn to the world we live in now, which is one dominated by capitalist globalization, and look at, give you my perspective on how a capitalist space economy works. And then look at how under this era of capitalism after colonialism, we've had different eras that we can think of as globalization, both a state-led era and a Keynesian era, if you will, and now a neoliberal era. And then look at how across both of these eras, uneven geographical development has been a persistent feature of globalization, and in the final analysis, a feature which really made globalization suddenly an unpopular idea for many. We look at how nature fits into this story. We look at some of the alternatives to capitalist globalization that are emergent. And then we'll ask the question about how we can think differently about these things from places like Jakarta to the way in which we conventionally think about them, which is from places like Chicago, and then draw some conclusions. What is this conventional account? Well, and I teach this, I've taught this to my students, and this is very much what they tell me. They say globalization is something that just started recently, a few decades ago. And that's certainly when the term globalization became popular in the academic literature. That is a capitalist process, specifically a neoliberal process, a market-oriented form, logic, if you will. It's seen as a rising tide with the potential to lift all boats, to bring development and prosperity to all. And it's something which is diffused really from the north to the south. And in many ways, sort of reiterates a very old idea from Walt Rostow from 1960. And this is this notion that through globalization, all places can follow a same sequence of steps from tradition, if you will, to modernity. This is a visualization of this from a lecture by a colleague of mine, where societies start in traditional position, then they prepare to take off, then they do take off, then they drive to maturity and high mass consumption. Those were Rostow's terms. And he presented this specifically as what he called a non-communist manifesto, a series of stages of capitalist development that all places can follow. And very much the idea behind neoliberal globalization is it could realize this trajectory for all countries willing to participate in the right kind of way in this global capitalist economic system. What is the spiritual temporality of this conventional way of thinking about globalization? Well, it's essentially about time. Space really doesn't matter very much at all. Each country should follow the same path. There are differences between countries. Of course, some places specialize in X and some specialize in Y. But as long as everybody plays by the rules of capitalism, the free trade doctrine guarantees sort of places can specialize in whatever their comparative advantage might be, and everybody benefits from the mutual exchange. So here's a situation where the connectivities between places reduce inequalities rather than increase them. So it really doesn't matter where a place is in the global economy. It just matters that it plays by these rules. And a consequence of this is that for places to do better, they don't have to manipulate their position in the world. They just have to change what they're doing locally. So we get the kind of place-based policy interventions that the World Bank and the IMF have been famous for, to say, well, every country should do X, Y, and Z. And if they do that, they get to play on a level playing field here. And importantly, this is the idea of a particular kind of development, big D development, as Gillian Hart and others have called it, and where in the image of the West, in the image of particularly the United States and the UK, where the West leads and others are following, struggling to catch up. So there's a clear hierarchy of leaders and followers, and the leaders here think that they have the answer to tell the others what they need to do in order to catch up. So that's the conventional view. But of course, as academics, when we interrogate these terms, we see much more than this convention suggests. And one way to do that is to take time seriously, not just the short-run dynamics of any capitalist economy, but the long-run historical perspective. And from that perspective, globalization has been going on in one way or another ever since we humans left Africa, connecting the world, narrowing the function of ecosystems. And these patterns of globalization have been driven by all kinds of logics and cultural norms and interests that not necessarily reducible to capitalism. We're talking about a process that's been going on for 10,000 years, right? Before the 1490s, before Europeans sailed the ocean blue, we really didn't have a global system. We had a series of regional systems built around empires: the Chinese Empire, the Roman Empire, the Inca Empire, and so on and so forth. And prior to the 1490s, Europe was a minor player in these global, in these regional systems. Systems as captured here in a map from Janet Abulugod that shows trading and interchange in these regional systems stretching across from East and Southeast Asia through the Indian Ocean, Middle East, with Europe in some sense on the edge, and with Europe being poor relative to the kind of wealth that could be seen when Europeans arrived in what we now call Delhi or in Xi'an and so on and so forth. But that changed, right? China itself had a globalization moment between 1405 and 1433 in our Western calendar. Zheng He took a series of huge, by those standards, treasure ships sailing under the sort of permission of the Chinese emperor to across the Indian Ocean into Southeast Asia, not with the intent of making money, but with the intent of displaying China's wealth and diplomatic skills, making contacts, if you will. And until 1433, when the emperor decided that that was something that China shouldn't be doing anymore, and he cut off this kind of moment. A moment that ended more or less as European globalization started to take off. So from the 1490s, Europeans set about exploring the world, building a world system, if you will, the first interconnected economic system that spanned the entire globe. One was built on racism, on dehumanizing people of color as not really fully worth including in society until they have become civilized, something that Edward Said has called a kind of Orientalist worldview that places Europeans at the pinnacle of civilization and other populations sort of not fitting this model in various kinds of ways, inadequate in various kinds of ways. This then justified things like chattel slavery and indentured labor that were key to the operation of this colonial system as it spread around the world. Setting about really reorganizing the economic geography and ecology of the world in a way which benefited Europeans, even as they claimed it was in the name of civilization. Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem called "The White Man's Burden," where in 1890, when the U.S. took over the Philippines, which I can't quote fully now, but basically says that it's the sort of it's up to the Europeans to go out there and it's our burden to civilize the natives, as you will. And these are some of the ways in which the world was reorganized. Colonialism reorganized the populations of the world. Europeans moved to North America and other white settler colonies and Hispanic colonies. Africans were dragged and died along the way to the Americas, where they were employed as chattel slaves. South Asians, East Asians, Southeast Asians were drawn on as kind of an indentured labor force and as sort of intermediaries between white colonizers and local populations as they were brought into places like Tanzania and Kenya. So the whole sort of population geography of the world was reshaped by this European colonial initiative. The sort of food geographies of the world were reshaped. Tea taken out of China after the Opium Wars, coffee originating in Northeast Africa, sugarcane from various places in the tropics, all were moved to be produced in plantations for European consumption as stimulants to support the work ethic, the work possibilities of European working populations. And similarly, the whole emergence of connections suddenly between the Americas and Europe led to what Carolyn Merchant has called the Columbian Exchange, where animals, various kinds of crops, but also diseases started moving between these countries with all kinds of unexpected consequences, particularly the depopulation of indigenous groups in the Americas through smallpox and other European diseases that they had not been able to develop any resistance to. The political geography of the world was changed as Europeans entered places like Africa, like the Middle East, and essentially created colonial nations with borders decided on by these European powers as they struggled with one another. In this case, the British trying to build an empire from Cairo to Cape Town, the Germans trying to connect German East Africa to Angola, the French trying to occupy French Africa. So the countries that we know today are all in some sense colonial constructions. And some of the problems they have come from them. The deindustrialization of Asia was part of this process through a whole series of activities, best documented in India, where the sophisticated Indian textile industry was essentially eliminated through a series of trade policies initiated by the British to bring that textile manufacturing to places like Manchester. These countries themselves were turned inside out. They were turned into from more or less self-sufficient, self-organizing places into places whose role it was to supply goods and labor to European colonizing powers, creating a kind of externally oriented economy rather than an internally oriented economy. And a massive amount of sheer money was accumulated from the mines and the populations of the Americas and brought by the Spanish and the Portuguese to Europe, or intercepted by British and French and Dutch pirates on the way to Europe, essentially bringing free money into Europe. So when you think about all of these kinds of processes, it gives a very different perspective on how we think about the emergence of capitalism, this thing that we now take for granted in Europe. Perspectives that can be sort of divided into place-based perspectives and connectivity-based perspectives. From the perspective of place, the idea was that Europe had something special. It had, in Weber's terms, a Protestant work ethic. It had the right kind of climate. It had the right kind of political system. So European success, if you like, was attributed to features, the place-based features of the European subcontinent. A process that you can think of as really, as Eurocentrism, of saying that Europe succeeded because Europe is a special kind of place. Race comes into this as well, of course, and religion. Versus a view which says actually the European capitalism would not have been possible without colonialism, because of all of the ways in which colonialism essentially initiated practices and made possible things in Europe that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. Even the factory system, historians have recently documented, was something which was developed as a form of production in the slave colonies of the Americas before being sort of brought to the urban factories that started to emerge in Europe in the mid-19th century. And as other historians and historical geographers have also documented, practices that we now think of as capitalist practices didn't sort of start in the 1980s in Europe, but can be found across the old world. People producing commodities for money, hiring workers in order to do so, trading these commodities with one another. This is going on in trading centers across the pre-colonial world. But we forget all of that because we can only think of capitalism as something that emerged in Europe. But what I would argue is that the capitalist practices that occurred across the pre-colonial world were a much more diverse set of practices than the form that capitalism took when it was brought to Europe. And it was that form of capitalism that has become the form that we now take for granted, the form defined by such 18th and 19th century European political economists as Marx, Smith, Ricardo, and so on. So when we define capitalism for our students, it's this particular European version that became the norm. But because of it's a product of colonialism, we can also think of this as a racial capitalism. Capitalism that became possible through a set of racial hierarchies and racialized attitudes towards different kinds of populations that have played out globally, but also, of course, now play out locally, because those populations also became part of European and North America, not just distant contributors to prosperity. So this brings us to capitalism. And with capitalism, we can think of as a system that has a series of social classes, each of whom are bringing production factors to bear on the economy. Those are the owners of these production factors. There are then various kinds of markets through which those factors are brought into the cycle of production of commodities. Commodities which are then sold as either producer goods or consumer goods, which are then consumed by capitalists, resource owners, workers, landowners, and so on, with money flows running in the opposite direction. So it's a cycle, if you will, that links different kinds of participants or classes in the economy, bringing different kinds of things to the production process, and in ways that are often unequal. We also need to think about this not as economists do, as a kind of sort of abstract economy on the pin, but as what we regional scientists would think of as a multi-sectoral, multi-regional economy with connections between the different economic sectors in the different regions, with transportation being a key sector making all this possible, because these connections don't operate without transportation infrastructure. And one of the things that I've argued when we think about the economy in this much more realistic way, I would say, than a reduced form macroeconomic model of the sort that you might find in neoclassical economics, is that transportation needs to be thought of as a key player in this process. The convention has been to think of transportation as just a cost of doing business, right? But transportation is actually a sector, and I want to talk about this. So here we have, thinking about how production happens. There are a series of inputs that come to a factory, brought there through the transportation sector. Those inputs are then deployed in the factory. Goods are produced, wages are paid. Those goods then are shipped out to other producers and other consumers. And it's a process that takes time. It can't be thought of as a static equilibrium. And a process that's always uncertain. You're never sure when you buy the inputs that you'll be able to sell the outputs. And depending on whether you can do that affects what you do in the next cycle of production. But let's focus on these means of accessibility. Because this is actually a commodity. It is something which is being produced for profit by the private sector, being supported by public sector investments, because it's so crucial to the profitability of capitalist production. When transportation is cheaper, faster, more efficient, then more money can be made in conventional factories. But that transportation sector is also a commodity. Their workers are being employed by transportation, by freight handlers and the like. And so accessibility is something that is being produced as a result of this. And the commodity that accessibility brings to market is the commodity of connectivity. And when you take the transportation sector and think of it in the same way as you think about the non-transportation sectors, that actually profoundly reshapes how you can think about how the economy works. It undermines a lot of the standard sort of parables of both mainstream but also Marxian political economy. But also it's a process through which space is being created, right? So as accessibility becomes faster, as new connections are built, as we get larger container ships and so on and so forth, all of that is changing the spatiality of the global economy by changing the ways in which and the degree to which places are connected together. So this is actually part of the way in which economic processes are changing the spatial organization of society. And those spatial organizations then feed back into economic possibilities in these various places. With some colleagues of mine, with Luke Bergman and Paul Plummer, we tried to sort of examine how this works out as a kind of dynamical process, with a series of individual firms buying and selling from firms in other regions, different firms in sectors in other regions. And what you learn when you sort of do the numbers, if you will, when you run the math, is that this capitalist space economy is a complex dynamical system. It's not a system that tends towards equilibrium. Equilibria are the exception and not the rule, and they're often knife-edge equilibria. Rather, the system is dominated by out-of-equilibrium dynamics, cycles, chaos, and so on, periodic crises. Like all complex dynamical systems, they are unpredictable. Something can suddenly change as a result of a minor effect. Think of the parable of the butterfly in the Amazon affecting global ecosystems. Rational expectations don't work because you're not sure what consequences are going to be of the actions that you take. And the very space-time of this system, as Prigogine has argued, is being reshaped by this process. So here's that socio-spatial dialectic again. And this then questions the primacy of the economic. It questions the degree to which sort of economic principles can solve all of these problems, because the economic system of capitalist space economy in and of itself is not a harmonious, self-organizing or self-regulating system. It's a system characterized by all of these instabilities and inequalities of various kinds. Nevertheless, that's a system which came to dominate how we organize the globe after the end of colonialism, dating roughly from the 1960s. We came into this post-colonial world, and in 1944, at the Bretton Woods Conference, before the end of the Second World War, the institutions were put in place to govern this now capitalist, now US-dominated global system, and with US sort of pushing the Europeans to actually sell off or liberate their economies, but also creating space for American imperial influence. And roughly speaking, we can gloss this as two phases. The phase from Bretton Woods until the late 1970s, when the consensus across the capitalist world, at least, but it really applied to the communist world too, was that the state was really important to making capitalist globalization work. It was the state's job to make sure that countries were not screwed by these economic relations, and that those who are disadvantaged were not screwed by these economic relations. So we got things like the New Deal in the United States. The Keynes, whose influence was behind this phase, described as saving capitalism from itself by the state stepping in to modulate the inequalities that otherwise would happen. But then after the crisis of Fordism in the 1970s in the West, that system was replaced really from the late 1970s, particularly from 1980, with Thatcher in the UK and Reagan in the United States, to a model of market-led globalization, where the idea was the state should step back and the market will in fact bring prosperity to all, influenced by the ideas of Keynes's former colleague at Cambridge, Hayek, once he moved to Chicago. So there are these two kinds of capitalist globalization, right? No, there's not just the neoliberal globalization. It's not just something that starts in the 1980s. This even capitalist globalization takes us back 80, 90 years. But across both of these models, we saw the same problem, which is that there was, I'm sorry, I forgot I had this slide in that gives you a sense of the sort of economic influence of particular European economists across this period of time. So we have the first era of globalization in the 19th century up until the World War I, which was dominated by the ideas of Smith and Ricardo. Then in the West, that was replaced by Keynes, to be followed by Hayek. And then in the no longer existing second world, the sort of socialist or communist world around the Soviet Union, it was Karl Marx's ideas that mattered. But across all of these eras, we see a persistent pattern of spatial polarization of wealth and poverty or uneven geographical development. And the argument here is that the capitalist processes are just as good at creating wealth and poverty across space as they do creating it socially between different social classes. Raising this question, right, of why is it that capitalism has failed? Globalization has failed. Capitalist globalization has failed to enrich the global South, failed in its own promise, the promise that if everybody plays by these rules, then everybody gets to prosper. And several reasons for this, one of which is that the colonies that became independent in name, but never independent in reality. They remained dependent on industrialized goods from the West. Their comparative advantage was in primary commodities rather than industrial commodities. So their positionality in the colonies remained very much their positionality in this post-colonial era too, of being sort of marginal and dependent on the former colonies and white settled colonies like the United States. And the geopolitical power relations reinforce this, the power being in the hands of these countries, whose development discourse is then telling the global South, the former colonies, what to do. Really didn't. There was one policy. This again, Rostow, everybody's supposed to follow. And I think a very particular example of this is this idea of the free trade doctrine, the notion that specialization in trade according to comparative advantage in its various manifestations, from Ricardo to people like Helpman and Krugman, as again, it enables countries to specialize and equally benefit from this process. And it's worth noting that the free trade doctrine was promulgated by the British in 1846, when they were in a position to benefit from this, because they had moved industrial production from South Asia and was reinventing it in Western Europe. The European countries went along for a few years and then abandoned it because it wasn't working for them. The US at Bretton Woods saw this as a key to as they became powerful, and China in 2016 became also so the idea, the free trade doctrine as an idea, if it's being pushed by the most powerful countries who are trying to get everybody else to play along with it, that tells us something that there may be some problems, that it doesn't work in the way in which the theory in all of its sort of abstract assumptions suggests. And we can see this empirically. We can look at the net barter terms of trade of third world countries or former colonies exporting primary commodities in return for industrialized goods, and a steadily declining sort of terms of trade here, with cycles, but certainly not a situation where their specialization in primary commodities was enabling them to catch up with the industrialized countries exporting industrial commodities, rather the reverse. And very different patterns of power, right? This is a calculation of the bargaining power of different countries in global trade relations. The countries which are larger and more diversified in their exports are more powerful in those relations because they're less dependent on the others. And that reinforces these kinds of inequalities and the well-established inequalities circulating around the GATT negotiations and the WTO negotiations. And a series of calculations has been done of the kind of unequal aspects of this. Here's one example. This is from the work of Luke Bergman, who sat down and used the global trade data to calculate how labor moves around the world. And we can see the labor being done in places like China, Southeast Asia, Africa. It's being done to meet the needs of consumers in Europe and North America, a kind of unequal exchange of labor. And there have been attempts to break this pattern. The New International Economic Order, the G77 group, more recently the group of 20 around the Cancun WTO negotiations about a decade ago, all trying to break this pattern, but never really able to do so. And we have inequalities also coming into existence within the global south, both within countries as elites become wealthier relative to the average person in those countries, but also among global south countries, with China as being the notable example, if you will, also places like Korea and Taiwan, as places that have been able to, in some sense, empower themselves within the global south and play a role in Africa and Asia that might look somewhat different, similar to the role played by European powers in those places a century ago. But more importantly, China's rise really impacted the West. It created these free trade patterns and the structural adjustment policies used to try and enforce market logics on countries, created a great deal of impoverishment across the global south, but nobody really paid attention to that until the same patterns started to be visible in places like the United States. So the US's trade with China was undermining US industrial workforces, creating sort of inequalities between those who are globally connected and those who are left out of which came the kinds of grassroots political protests that Trump could take advantage of, that Boris Johnson and the Brexit referendum could take advantage of, with even Biden now much more focused on national economic policies than global solutions. But the important point here is that it's only when these inequalities become noticed in the wealthy countries that the idea of globalization becomes controversial. It was never controversial in those countries as long as the impoverishment was only happening in the global south. What are the spatial temporalities of this globalization? Well, the connectivities between countries are not reducing inequality. They're often mutually, there's no equalizing spatial equilibrium, if you will, but they're often mutually reinforcing. A process in which some places which are getting wealthy are not just getting wealthy because of certain local conditions they have there, but are getting wealthy as a result of their unequal economic connections with poorer places. And here, all of a sudden, geography does matter. Where you're positioned within the global economy is going to shape this, because if you're in a marginal position, then you're being undermined often by these connectivities rather than benefiting from them. And you see periodic disruptions of these hierarchies. You see the United States emerging in the 20th century. You see China emerging in the 21st century. But core periphery patterns of uneven geographic development are remarkably persistent. And place-based solutions aren't the answer, because if you're disadvantaged because of your of unequal trade relations with other countries, no amount of changing the local conditions inside the country, reducing expenditures on the state, improving economic markets, is going to solve these problems. There's also World Bank conditionality rules, UN's sustainable development, there should be goals, it's SDGs, are all noble ideas, but they're not good. They don't overcome these differences of these disadvantages of positionality, if you will, leaving people across the global south, however you define that, as questioning capitalist development. The term global south, I think of, has complex meanings. On the one hand, it can be very geographical. It can be about places that are disadvantaged, that are poor, versus places that are wealthy, places that were colonizers versus places that were colonized. But it really is also about people all around the world, including in the United States, who are living, who find themselves in a precarious positionality and unable to participate fully in the wealth being created, no matter how much they try to do so and play by these capitalist rules. What about nature? Well, I can only talk about this very briefly at this point, but we've always treated the more than human world as a resource for human enrichment. The phrase often used these days is extractive capitalism. but it has its own agency. So this is this socio-natural dialectic that I introduced in the introduction. We see ways in which not only are there natural disasters, let's call them earthquakes and things like that, but global warming creating all kinds of new sort of disasters and challenges, and the ways in which people living in different parts of the world are very unequally vulnerable to these kinds of processes. So we can build seawalls to protect New York from the next Hurricane Sandy, but nobody has the resources to do that kind of thing in Bangladesh. And ways in which ways in which we extract wealth out of nature, extract resources out of nature, reinforce global patterns of uneven geographical development. This is again a visualization of one aspect of this from Luke Bergman, showing how carbon flows around the country through its extraction, of petrochemicals and coal and natural gas, and the same kind of dynamic of ways in which these embedded carbon flows tend to benefit the wealthy parts of the world at the expense of others. And there's a recent paper by Hickel and co-authors in Global Economic Change, came out maybe 2 months ago, and they're doing this calculation for all kinds of aspects of the biophysical world, in each case seeing the same thing, a kind of unequal exchange in which the, if you like, ecological wealth is flowing from poorer parts of the world to wealthier parts of the world. Again, a mutually reinforcing rather than a modulating set of connectivities. Can we solve this problem by pricing nature correctly, by internalizing the cost, the environmental costs, and putting it into the prices through carbon markets and the like? I'm very skeptical that those can solve the problem, because they do turn nature into a commodity. But nature is always more than just a commodity. It has its own biophysical properties and dynamics, which you can't really just tame in the way that you can in a conventional commodity. Or can we find a just energy transition? This is certainly a central theme all of a sudden for capitalist globalization, but it's complicated. Just take the example of lithium. And lithium we think of as helping accelerate the energy transition through the batteries replacing fossil fuels. But then there's a whole political economy of lithium production, who benefits from lithium, whose livelihoods are undermined by the extraction of lithium from vulnerable places. The show points at and reminds us that this is not a straightforward solution. How is globalization being contested? Well, it's being contested from the right, correct? I mean, this is the sort of anti-globalist Republican in the US, or the sort of global Britain advocate in the UK. It's been contested from the left through all kinds of anti-capitalist, environmentalist, anti-growth movements, socialist alternatives and experiments. It's been contested from below through sort of people's community economic practices, which don't really follow the rules of capitalism, sharing economies, if you will. But also through something which is pervasive across the global south, which are the informal economic practices where markets are in operation, but not really being governed by conventional principles of capitalism, of a private ownership regulated by state legal practices. And it's been contested from above. It's not, but China, I would argue, has a more than capitalist economy these days. It can't be reduced to just Chinese capitalism or capitalism with Chinese characteristics. And it's gone global through the Belt and Road Initiative, right? And the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and through with dramatic effects on trading patterns between China and other parts of the world. So China, again, is the exception that perhaps proves the rule. The country that whose size and whose effectiveness at running an economy has helped it sort of buck the trend. How do we think about this? Well, one way to think about this is to remember that that there are other ways of other experiences of the world, other expertise of the world, which is not really visible when we look at the world through the lens of a sort of northern model of how capitalism works, a model which is based on the idea of an economy that's largely self-sufficient and made up of a series of sectors, the sort of input-output model I showed before. Because how we think about the world, it depends on where we think about the world from. And when we think of it from sort of, if you like, ignored, marginalized, disadvantaged positionalities, we often see the world in a very different kind of way. This is certainly true around theories of globalization. And there's an emergence now of this idea of Southern theory, of saying that the theories of economic development and how the economy works that we take as the norm, the sort of theories that with the heritage going back to people like Ricardo and Smith, really don't capture the very different features of economic systems in the global South. And this has been a long debate. I've traced this, and first world perspectives on how to bring prosperity to other parts of the world have always been very different from the perspectives from those experiencing the impact of first world ideas on those third world locations. And so the notion of a Southern theory, not to replace the theories of capitalism we have now, but to enrich them by paying attention to the greater geographical variety, becomes really important. I'm not going to go into Jakarta. I don't have time. You can ask me about this at the end. But what conclusion from this? Well, the first thing I conclude is that capitalist globalization is not a panacea, that it tendentially, historically, has reproduced spatial inequalities that we can often trace back to the inequalities created under European colonialism. Second, if we take this as a starting point, that opens space for us to take other alternatives seriously. What alternatives? Well, when you start looking around, this has been my experience in doing research and sort of embedding myself in places all around the world, is there are many alternatives that are out there already that are being imagined, theorized, and even practiced from all kinds of different starting points, geographical, social starting points, that need to be, and those are the alternatives we need to start to take more seriously. And there are many of them out there, right? And so that becomes a challenge. How do we decide between the various alternatives out there? Well, the first step is to take them seriously and create space for them to be articulated and part of the global conversation about how globalization, our global world, should operate. There's a danger of assessing them from our experience, because this is the inside of Southern theory, that it looks very differently from different sort of starting points. Can we really make sense of Chinese more than capitalist economy if we're trying to assess it through the principles of Western capitalism, right? We need to empower these marginal voices, give them a chance to be heard and to be taken seriously. We need to have ethico-political commitments from which we can assess the positives and negatives of these various alternatives. And we need to be cognizant of the idea that there's no universal best practice. There's no path to development which works the same everywhere. They always have to, their feasibility always have to be assessed given the particular spatial temporal conjuncture in which they might be applied. Thank you.
Thank Professor Sheppard gave a great talk about how actually from historical perspective to see these different capitalist theories to understand currently the capitalist globalization, to see the relationships about capital labor and natural. So currently we open to the question to see. So I'm wondering, you have a slide that shows the bargain power. So I'm wondering for that bargain power and how actually that come up with that bargain power for different regions.
The principle behind this is my own sort of empirical calculations, is to ask the question, well, when a country goes to, let's say, a World Trade Organization meeting to try and bargain for new policies and so on, these countries have very unequal capacity to affect those conversations. We know this from studying. Yeah. And the bargaining power is calculated according to two principles. The first principle is that bigger countries are more powerful. So countries which have a larger share of the global trade market have more influence because the smaller countries tend to be more dependent on the large ones. So your share of the global trade is one factor. And the other factor is the degree to which your country is specialized in just particular exports. So a country like Nigeria, where 85% of its export is oil, it has not much flexibility in bargaining because it's so dependent on a single commodity. But a country like the United States, which with a massively broad set of export profiles, think of the atlas but produced by Houseman and people, again has more flexibility because if things are not operating well in one sector, in some sense you can switch to another. So this bargaining power index that I calculated essentially is economic size divided by specialization. And
I see. So then, in your view, how the global South countries maybe based on just now you mentioned the principles, is have a smaller share, if trade share, the size is smaller. So then how they can have use their just now you mentioned the other principle is they are expertise advantages. So for each export expertise advantages. So how actually these global South countries, even they are small size, but how they can take advantage of their expertise, no matter is natural resources or other resource advantages to improve or increase their bargaining power to
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think,
growth.
I mean, for many countries in the global South, which and there are exceptions, China is of course the most important exception, there are small players in the global trade market, but also highly specialized players in the global trade market. Really, the only way in which they can, within the confines of this system, can enhance their bargaining power is through collaboration, through working together rather than working individually. And the idea of the new international economic order that emerged in the 1970s, and the group of 20 southern countries that emerged in the Cancun negotiations in the early 2000s were attempts by third world countries to come together and create more power by operating collectively. So that's one option. And another option would be for these sort of southern countries to disentangle themselves from disadvantageous trade relations with the global north and engage in more trade with one another. Now, that traditionally has been a very difficult strategy because if most of these countries are producing primary commodities, they can't really trade for industrial goods with one another. They're still dependent on the global north. But as we've seen in the case of China, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, as countries have found a way to broaden their economic base and become exporters of higher end and industrial goods and not just primary commodities, then they can play a role in these South-South relations, where, for example, Nigeria can trade oil with China for machinery instead of trading oil with Britain for machinery. That would be a South-South relation. But then the question that comes up, and one to which we don't yet, I think, have a very clear answer, is whether those relations, let's say, between China and the various African countries which it now has active trade and investment relations, is that a rising tide that lifts African boats, or is it one that empowers China relative to other countries in the global south? A reminder that the global south is a highly, if we think of the global south as a region of the world, it's a highly sort of abstract and homogenizing idea for what are actually a very diverse group of countries in terms of political systems, resources, attributes, and so on. And so we should not assume that just because you're in the global south, you have a common interest with everybody else in the global south. It's much more complex than that.
Yeah, definitely. So then yeah, that's very interesting. Actually, you mentioned like when China and African currently have this South-South the relationship. So can I understand like your suggestion is for the countries it's because currently we have so which means just now you mentioned it's like more this kind of free trade agreement regions will strengthen these global south countries, but the global south countries also need to be very selectively what this agreement they actually join or participate in.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So, I mean, the parallel which is often drawn is to say, well, under colonialism, African countries were essentially forced to export commodities to Europe, and then Europeans would come to those countries first as occupiers and later as consultants to tell them to try and help those countries do better. And we see a similar kind of relationship now between China and these countries, whereby these countries export goods to China in return for Chinese manufacturing, but also Chinese investment initiatives and Chinese expertise. And from the point of view of a country like Nigeria or Kenya that might get involved in these relationships, there's something about working with China which makes it feel less dependent than working with the World Bank, because China doesn't impose these kinds of conditionalities of how you need to change your political and economic system before we can help you. So the money seems, in some sense, there are fewer strings attached to the money, but there's still the same set of questions are being asked. To what degree are these Chinese companies now operating in Africa, empowering African-owned firms, bringing more wealth to African workers or not? And this is a huge debate, and I don't think we have enough empirical evidence yet to really know the answer. But on the one hand, you have there's a book called The New Scramble for Africa by a former student of mine, Porrick Carmody, who's documented this in a very critical way, suggesting, well, this is in many ways just a new kind of colonialism, except with Chinese rather than European characteristics. But you get a very different perspective from the point of view of Chinese experts who are looking at these patterns. But these are the kinds of questions that come up, right? So as relationships strengthen between countries that we think of as part of the global south, are they doing so in such a way that those countries are all sort of mutually benefiting from this? So these are connectivities which are sort of leveling the playing field. Are they creating new inequalities within the global south?
Yeah, it's definitely. So then, like when you say besides like the inequality between North, South, and within the global South, so how did you see it? Because just now you mentioned different capitalists, like from right, from left, and above, and also
Yes, right.
below. So certainly, like in global South, as just now you mentioned, it's also complexity for this like strength relationship. So then how did you see like for like China, Asia, you did like Jakarta. So these are two different type. Like China is more like from the top, Asia and Jakarta based on is more like informal, a lot of informal
Yeah,
sectors.
yeah.
So it's from the below community informal sectors. How did you see for these two types of capitalists can actually participating in this globalization and strengthen them and contribute to reduce the inequality?
All right. Yeah. So I mean, I think I've taken China as an example of contesting globalization from the top because it's a large nation state, right, that is explicitly critical of the North American European model of capitalist globalization. The Belt and Road Initiative is an attempt to create a different development model. I mean, people like a series of Chinese scholars and scholars working with the Chinese are making this kind of argument. In many ways, they're making the same kind of argument that Americans have long made about American form of globalization. This is win-win. Everybody will benefit from this. The Chinese model, this is not, they say, and I think this is true, particularly under Xi, this is no longer can be just thought of as a kind of capitalism. It's something different. It's some mixture of state socialism and capitalism that is having a powerful effect on the world, right? So all of a sudden, Europe, the European Union has decided it needs its own kind of Belt and Road Initiative to counter the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. But in China, so in some sense, China is directing from above a more than capitalist or non-capitalist, however you want to call it, version of economic development and trying to propagate that globally through its relationships with the various countries in the BRI. When you turn to Jakarta or turn to Indonesia, the kinds of alternatives which are most evident there are these alternatives in the grassroots, people figuring out ways on a daily basis to try and eke out a living informally through economic activities that are not necessarily privately owned, that are not regulated by the state, even though they are producing goods and there are markets in operation. They're not really capitalist markets. There's some other kinds of markets. And in Jakarta, 2/3 of the population is living in informal settlements and making its living through informal economic activities. And all of the sort of mainstream theories we have about how urban economies work from the West don't talk about informality. They assume that somehow that's not important. So here's an insight that comes from looking at a place like Jakarta, which says there's a whole series of kinds of economic activities going on here, which are not captured by the theories that we've learned in school about how urban economies work. And how do those theories need to be supplemented, questioned by taking seriously what's going on there? But I would also say, again, this is part of our research in Indonesia, that also from the top within Indonesia, the kind of way in which the economy is governed is quite different from the standard capitalist model we learn in school. So in Indonesia, as Dimitar Anguilov has shown in his research in our research group, you see the state prioritizing state-owned and city-owned enterprises for delivering infrastructure rather than handing that over to the private sector. And one of the reasons that China is doing this, that Indonesia is doing this, is because the Indonesian political system has become increasingly influenced by both China and Japan. And it's much less US-centric as it was under Suharto, who was pushed out of office now 25 years ago. So even at the larger level within Indonesia, we argue that you have kind of a hybrid economy of state and market, which doesn't look quite like how we theorize capitalist-based economies in the West. It doesn't sort of spread to other places in the way in which the Chinese model is being spread to other places. But within Indonesia, we see these alternatives emerging from above as well as from below.
Mm-hmm. So, so which means if we can understand they may meet at some point from top and some from above. Yeah. That's very interesting. So, then how did you see? Because you mentioned like even within the same type of like from above, like China is from the top, and how did you see this different or same? Because in term with like Japan and Korea in terms of raster model and takeoff stage. So since these two countries both also, I wouldn't say they exactly same as China from the top, but actually they are takeoff is contributed largely by the state-owned multinational companies. So
state-owned or state-supported, like the chaebol in Korea, for example. Yes, so I mean, I think it's fair to describe the Korean or the Japanese economy as a particular kind of capitalism, but a rather different kind of capitalism to to the free market model, which we have come to see as kind of the normal form, the British or the American model. But even within Europe, you see the state influence being much more acceptable in a country like Germany or Austria or France than would be the case in Britain or the Netherlands. So there's a literature on varieties of capitalism, which talks about a sort of a series of national capitalist systems that range from the free market model at one end, which is the US, the UK model, to various kinds of interventionist models where the state is playing a much more proactive role in shaping national development, and Japan, Korea, Taiwan, but also, as I said, to some degree, places like Germany fall into that here. So this is a whole spectrum of different kinds of national capitalisms that are operating, and they're operating in the context of at least they have been operating in the context of a sort of global capitalist model, which is dominated by market-oriented neoliberal principles. So we see, for example, in Japan, in Korea, but particularly in places like Germany, over the last 30 years, as neoliberal globalization became seen as the sort of default way to develop the world, we see this role of the state being scaled back, and market mechanisms being given more space to operate within those countries. This is a process that Jamie Peck calls neoliberalization, a process of increasing market influence relative to the state. But nevertheless, these differences from country to country in terms of the importance of the state in the economy remain, and they've been very important. I do not think Korea, Taiwan, or Japan would have been as successful as they were if the state had simply stepped back and let the market operate. It was the state choosing national champions, supporting national champions, linking them up with domestic financial institutions to finance their productivity. In the case of Korea, pushing back against labor organizing to keep wages low. So there are those kinds of differences, but there is also a question of whether this means that every national economy in the world could be think of as some kind of capitalist economy. And here's where I don't quite buy that argument. I think that if you look at China, particularly again under Xi, the sheer power of the state to try and control entrepreneurs, make them subservient to the needs of the party, suggests that even though there are capitalist processes happening in China, we shouldn't really just call it a kind of capitalism. It's something more complicated than that. And I think to a lesser degree that's true in Indonesia, and I would say more generally more common in Asia than, say, in Africa or Latin America. And I think that goes back to long traditions of the importance of politics and community in Asian countries.
Yeah, definitely, I agree. It's kind of back to your mentioned at the very beginning. Actually, is even for the same country, there is essentially temporality is important. Actually, not just the geography.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That temporality is a kind of inherited geography, right? It's the ways in the past, let's say, the geography of cultural norms and ways of and sort of ways in which people think about how society should be organized are remarkably persistent, even as we move into these very different economic eras.
Yes. So the last question is in the end you mentioned the natural. So the natural vulnerability actually. So then how did you see for this besides the label, the capital, how these global South countries, when they collaboration, because just now you mentioned collaboration is very important for their growth, but when they collaboration with other countries and no matter is joint agreements or other forms of collaboration, how they can protect them or maybe develop them in the long term in terms of this natural conservation or sustainable development.
Yeah, I mean, I think a starting point here is to think about how the ways in which human economic activity has altered the biophysical environment of the world. So instead of thinking about nature as just a resource from which we can take stuff out with no consequences, we see all of these kinds of ways in which, as we take stuff out of nature, nature starts to operate in different kinds of ways, which come to be highly problematic, ranging from global warming and its effects to things like the crisis of groundwater in the United States that the New York Times wrote about a few days ago. So these are all, if you like, unintended consequences of taking a rather naive approach to looking at nature as just something we can take stuff out of to benefit ourselves rather than take seriously. And of course, the Sustainable Development Goals in part are about pushing us to take nature more seriously. But this, again, this has highly unequal effects depending on who you are, right? So, or where you're located. So countries in the global south would be much more vulnerable to the same kind of environmental disaster than countries in the global north, because they don't have FEMA, they don't have reinsurance operations, they have to struggle to do these things themselves. And within each of these countries, there are great differences in vulnerability. So you go to, say, Brazil, and it's the populations living in the most vulnerable locations are often the poorer populations. Same is true in the US. This has been the sort of environmental justice movement. And so these effects we have on the environment have highly socially unequal aspects to them. And the question for me here always is this question of whether we can, as we try and solve these problems, can we solve them by setting a set of goals for all countries to meet, which has been the UN model, right? We have the Millennium Development Goals. Now we have the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a sense of, it's a way of saying, look, this is a problem that's more or less the same everywhere, and we can set up a set of indicators, and if we score well on those indicators, that problem will disappear. Well, this is part of this notion of saying that there's a kind of universal model that can be applied everywhere. And I think if there's one thing I've learned as a geographer, it's that this never works. There's never, and places are different. The condition, the context in which they find themselves are different. And we can't just make things better by changing conditions locally, by everybody doing the same thing locally, because what is possible locally is so profoundly affected by what's happening elsewhere. We can't solve those problems by just making these solutions. So I've become convinced over the years that the idea of a universal best practice as a policy intervention is way too naive. It doesn't take into account the social and geographical variability between, but also within countries, and that requires solutions that might be quite different in one place to another, because it isn't just about making things better locally. It's about how what's possible locally depends on what's happening elsewhere in our connections to those other places, and how these things operate from scale. So what ways in which sort of powerful global organizations impose ideas on localities, again with the idea that everybody should be, that there's one solution to apply everywhere. And I think when you think geographically, it just doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, because
we have to be looking for environmental solutions that are tailored to the local conditions. So let's say a sustainable form of agriculture that works in the Midwest is not going to be a sustainable form of agriculture that works in equatorial Africa.
Yeah, so eventually we need to work together, since because of the connectivity you mentioned. So as just now you mentioned, one place locally may not solve just by themselves, because they are affected by surroundings.
Yeah, I mean, yes, and I mean, and this has been the dominant idea in most sort of policy, which is we change things locally, and but some ways it makes sense. What else can you do except try and change things in the place where you live, right? So, but that model only works if the connectivities between places are mutually beneficial, or if those connectivities don't matter. Well, we know they matter, and we know they're not. I think we have lots of evidence to suggest they're not beneficial. So that suggests that simply trying to solve problems locally, or to solve problems by getting people from different countries to sit in the same room, like the COP agreements, and come up with with something which everybody is going to do the same, it's never really going to get us to the right answer. And that's one reason why these COP agreements and the trade negotiations have always been so problematic, because there are countries which say this just doesn't work for us. Well, this may work for the United States, but it doesn't work for us. But you're using your power to sort of force us to follow these models, and so then these agreements fall apart, or they become, people don't adhere to them, or they become watered down to the point where they don't mean anything, because you can't just solve these problems by setting up a common framework to apply everywhere.
Then what's your thoughts about the maybe alternative to this COP 26 this solution, instead of like have a common framework? So do you think actually if we can have a framework by region will be more it will be better?
I mean, I think that's a great question to which I don't think I've got a good answer, to be honest. I mean, I think we've seen how difficult it is to make progress with these kinds of multinational negotiations. How little we've come from Rio in 1992 to where we are now, and I don't have a simple alternative to suggest, but what I do want to urge, and this is kind of what I was trying to say at the end of the talk, is that we need to be looking for and paying attention to other ways of doing things, and not just going along with the same model that we've done in the past. And then we have to get beyond place-based solutions. This may mean collaboration. but I think we also have to pay attention to what people are doing on an everyday level, and not just thinking about it from the point of view of national policy making. We know in the United States, for example, that, I mean, it's less true under Biden than it was under Trump, but that the national policy on sustainability is very different from what's happening at local levels. And often what's happening at the local levels seems to be much more effective than anything which tries to be negotiated through Congress and the president, right? And so we need to be looking at local initiatives. We need to be looking at this, at what of how people have addressed these problems local in their own communities in the past, and really trying, as the first thing here is to say it's important to look at these alternatives and not just continue with what's not really working now. But then there's the challenge of but once you've identified those alternatives and created space to pay attention to successful experiments that nobody has heard about, but were actually quite effective, is then to try and figure out which of those approaches are the approaches that might work in a particular local context. First, you have to identify what some of these alternative sort of practices and successes are, and secondly, you have to have a way of trying to decide whether they work for where you are. And I think just one final point here. I think it would be too simplistic to say that there haven't been attempts to sort of develop policies that take into account global connectivities. For example, the trade negotiations that have been going on for the last 50 years, from the GATT to the WTO, have always been about trying to change trade relations, or at least from the perspective of the South. But it's been very, very difficult to actually make much progress in reshaping the global trading relations in ways that don't persistently disadvantage countries that are not producing manufactured or refined commodities. That we see in Indonesia right now, the president is urging the country to restrict nickel exports to try and force nickel refiners to come to Indonesia, because the money is in refining, not in just digging it out of the ground. But certainly there have been these kinds of attempts, but I think we also see in the history of the global trade relations that it really hasn't brought the kind of changes that people like Joe Stiglitz think should be brought in order to rewrite those relationships in ways that really empower countries that are not doing very well from them. But we're now in a weird place with respect to trade relations, right? Because for a long time, the WTO was all about forcing countries to adhere to free trade principles. Otherwise, you'd be penalized in the courts of the WTO, right? But all of a sudden, starting with Trump, but now everybody's doing it, countries are saying, we're not paying attention to the WTO anymore. We're going to try and do this in ways which make sense to us, rather than ways that conform to some kind of global neoliberal bureaucracy. And that may be good and it may not be good. We'll see. But in some ways, we're seeing all of a sudden, as I suggested at one point in the talk, I think the era of unfettered neoliberal globalization is an era that's now somewhere behind us. We're no longer in that world. We're in a world where national interests matter, where we're in an era where countries are more willing to sort of impose barriers against flows that they think are against their interest. We're in a world where national territories are more vulnerable to military occupation, right? We're away from a world dominated by global economic connections. And in some ways that may be good, but in some ways it may be bad. But I think we're already, I think, in a different kind of globalization than one that existed from 1980 to about 2016. And exactly what we have in front of us now, I don't think we really know.
Yeah, definitely. Totally agree. We need to have more framework alternative for the countries to choose.
Right. That's right.
I think have one question from the let me see. So one question Bogdan have question is would the economic development of a regional also depend on structure of local social foundations, such as the fact where places depend on community participation, where other places would only have the foundation that person only dependent on themselves?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a really important question. I mean, part of what I've been trying to argue today and stressing the importance of these connectivities and these unequal connectivities between places in shaping development possibilities is to argue, is to present something which is an alternative to the place-based way of thinking. But one shouldn't conclude from that what happens locally doesn't matter. It does. And it's, in some sense, economic development has to be about paying attention to the conditions you have locally, and to your global connections, but also how those global connections are shaping what you have locally. So I think it is important when we're thinking about economic development to think about the attributes and the conditions that you have locally, but not to conclude from that that's all that matters. You may not be able to change some of those local conditions in ways you thought you could, because they are that way as a result of connectivities to other places, and then they can't be simply changed. So yes, it has to be both. It has to be both paying attention to local conditions and paying attention to how local conditions are shaped by broader connectivities and influences.
Okay, thank you, Professor Sheppard. Give us extraordinary, insightful, and inspirational talk. I learned a lot from this talk. Thank you so much, and also thanks.
My pleasure.
Thanks for the audience for the questions.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Thank you,
Yeah.
everybody, for listening, and thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed myself.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure. I think it's a great honor, as I said.
Hopefully we can meet personally at some point.
Yeah, definitely.